The Horse Race is brought to you by Benchmark Strategies, Boston's leading public affairs and public relations consulting firm. To learn more, connect with Benchmark on LinkedIn at Benchmark Strategies or visit benchmark-strategies.com.
Welcome back to The Horse Race, your weekly look at politics, policy, and elections in Massachusetts. I'm Jennifer Smith, reporter for Commonwealth Beacon, joined today by both Steve Koczela and Rich Parr of the MassINC Polling Group, president and vice president respectively, and it is Thursday, November 6th. We're recording on Wednesday, right after a slew of elections in Massachusetts and across the country, so let's start local, then zoom on out. Guys, how was your election night?
Well, my election night was different because I'm now 8 hours ahead. As any listeners to the pod recently know, I'm in Nairobi, and Kenya doesn't do daylight savings time. So I was 7 hours ahead for last week's show, and now I'm 8 hours ahead. So I woke up around 6 when my kids woke me up for school and tuned in to see what had happened. And it was just as lots of races were being called, all the good analysis was up. You know, the Melrose override was called and so forth. So my election night was actually wonderful because I didn't have that sort of existential terror moment from like 8 to 10 when you don't know how the polls did, you don't know how elections went, and there's really nothing to know. I just woke up and everything was right there waiting for me.
So what you're describing is like the 1940s?
It is.
You just go to sleep and then you wake up and you find out what happened.
Right. You go out and you get the newspaper and, unfold it with your cup of coffee as you're sitting on your chair with your shag carpet and learn what happened. That's sort of how my day was.
It's great. Rich, did you also operate on a 6 to 8 hour delay just out of solidarity, or were you up refreshing with everybody else in the middle of the night?
Well, I had plans to go to an election night party here in Northampton because we'd had a whole bunch of elections here. But my child was sick, so I was home on my couch, switching between CNN and MSNBC and checking all my different tabs. And the one thing I was struck by was how quickly some of these big nationally watched races were called. I mean, I think they called the proposition vote out in California as soon as the polls closed, right? So you didn't even need to stay up very late for that one. In fact, I think we knew more about New Jersey and Virginia and New York City even before we knew the official results of the Northampton mayor's election, which is kind of crazy.
That is wild. Yeah, I had the lucky, blessed, unlucky, cursed experience of needing to be up very, very early for Supreme Judicial Court coverage. So I basically crashed out as soon as those West Coast races were called and was like, I'll come back to this at 6 a.m. So in some ways, Steve, I was kind of more on your wavelength where I was like, I'll deal with this when it's actually finalized. And actually, for Melrose, one thing that was interesting is they had their unofficial results up pretty quickly. When I was going through kind of scanning whatever had happened the night before, I could link to a patch story at least. Let's not talk about the state of local journalism, but there were official results I could point to. And then there was local coverage of every race I was monitoring, which was kind of a nice change from some earlier years. So, they're not always award-winning long reads, but at least if you were looking up who won in Gloucester, you would get an answer from a news organization and not just an AI summary of it. So that was nice.
Yeah, and Melrose too. I mean, that's a first, honestly. Like several cycles ago now, there was media coverage, there was, there was data from the AP and so forth, but the last few there has been nothing. So it looks to me as though the City Hall was just like, okay, well, we'll just put it up ourselves, kind of like Boston does, except much faster than Boston usually does. So that was great. And I hope that they keep doing it. It just meant that everybody wasn't frantically, trying to figure out who'd heard anything and who, would happen to be down at the gym where the votes are being, fed into the machine and looked at the ticket. It's just like, let's just skip all that, okay? We're all looking for the same data, put it on the internet, and let's move on.
Rich, you mentioned that, of course, you were following stuff in Northampton, but kind of on a macro level, what were you watching in Massachusetts? You know, the thing that we keep referring to in Melrose was a Prop 2.5 override. It passed the highest override it possibly could, which was $13.5 million. But there was a lot of other stuff going on all over the state. So were you also watching Melrose, or were you keeping an eye on your version of a local?
I mean, I was keeping an eye on Northampton. We had a record number of people running for office this year, and the mayor's race ended up being extremely tight. I think 76 votes difference. That's why it took so long to get the official results. But I was also looking at East Hampton. East Hampton elected a new mayor. The longtime mayor of East Hampton, Nicole LaChapelle, is now running the Department of Conservation and Recreation for the Healy administration. So there's been an interim mayor, and last night the voters elected the interim mayor to become the permanent mayor there, beating out two other candidates in a ranked choice arrangement. So I haven't gotten into the weeds on that one yet, but there were a couple of other mayoral races out here, I believe. I think Westfield had a mayor's election, but there was plenty in Northampton to keep me busy because that was, up and down from school committee up to mayor. There was all kinds of stuff happening.
And Jen, I want to pass it back to you because the good team at Commonwealth has a story about some of the other mayoral elections closer into Boston. Particularly, we had Everett, obviously the city of Boston itself, and you've mentioned Gloucester a couple times. So what things were you, and I see Michael Jonas's byline here, what were you looking at closer into Boston?
So one of the things that we were considering as everybody watched it sort of plow toward an inevitable conclusion here in Boston, because there was one candidate on the ballot. That is Mayor Michelle Wu, still Mayor Michelle Wu. So not only is it sort of become like a truism or a standing joke at this point that you don't really lose a race as incumbent mayor of Boston, no matter what the political climate. You have to be, James Curley level of character plus corrupt to be booted out basically in the biggest city in New England. But every once in a while, other mayors are not so secure. So we wanted to take a little bit of a look back and say, well, let's say over the past decade or so that we're at least kind of clocking it in with the current political climate. How risky is it to be a mayor who's seeking re-election? Of course, we've got 351 cities and towns. Not all of them have, a straightforward mayor system. Some of them have aldermen, selectmen, councils, various things. But I went back until 2015 and found that since then, only about a dozen mayors who are running for re-election have ever lost until this year. So now I think that brings it up to about 15 mayors who have. So being mayor in a city in Massachusetts remains a pretty safe bet overall. But one of the funny results today, though obviously not for the incumbent, is in Gloucester, Greg Verga, who was the incumbent, had himself ousted an incumbent 4 years ago, and then this time around is an incumbent himself ousted by about 15 points. So it's not fairly common that incumbents get booted, but it's not impossible as long as you are somewhere that is not literally the hub.
Okay, then let's talk about two other places. We also have interesting results with mayoral implications following similar contours in Everett, and one in Quincy where the mayor actually wasn't on the ballot, but kind of was. So what happened in Everett first and then Quincy?
So Everett has had Carlo Di Maria is in office for 17 years, but in the last little while had been under pretty intense scrutiny, specifically for a situation around being awarded so-called longevity bonuses, where there was an extra $180,000 that went his way that were kind of hidden from public view. So that brought in a lot of scrutiny, and therefore challenger, who is city councilor Robert Van Kampen, said, I'm going to bring transparency back to city government, and did beat Di Maria by 9 percentage points. So not like a complete blowout, but a pretty good margin there, especially if you're talking about a 17-year incumbent. So that was the only other one where an incumbent was on the ballot and did not succeed. But you mentioned, of course, that in Quincy, there was a lot of brouhaha over the mayor receiving a really, really substantial pay bump that the city council still approved. And so when voters ended up going to the ballot box on Tuesday, they ushered in a majority of kind of reform candidates to the Quincy City Council. So the mayor remains safe, but the kind of broader trajectory of how much they're rubber stamping any of his particular policies, that looks likely to change going forward.
It's interesting that the issue of mayoral pay really kind of is the link between those two situations there. And I like this longevity bonus thing. Steve, I think I might have to hit you up for one of those at some point in the future.
You just have to pass it without telling me. I think that's the key. That's
okay.
how you do it, is you just like
hide it in a
pencil
spreadsheet.
Hide it in
somewhere.
an 8-hour
Right,
time
exactly.
difference. So.
Exactly. But of course, one thing that we talked about briefly last week, which we should probably note, is there was another incumbent who was ousted, but not in this election, the previous one. Katiana Ballantyne, mayor of Somerville, didn't make it through the preliminary election. And so the question was essentially what the city was going to do to replace her in her stead. And so progressive at-large city councilor Jake Wilson was elected to take the post. So Somerville, already a pretty leftward-leaning city, looks like it's going to swing even further in that direction. So that is the roundup of the incumbents. A few did hold off some challenges, but that's just frankly not as interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, incumbents winning is sort of a dog bites man, I think, to use the journalism colloquialism. So let's just pass those by. And as we're passing them by, we are going to get on the freeway and drive first down to New Jersey, because that's the state that's closest to us that had a major election. Actually, I guess that's not true. We have to pass through New York City to get to New Jersey. So should we start in New York or should we start in New Jersey?
I want to know what your obsession with road directions has been lately before I agree to anything.
I'm trying to think of how to make it so it's not just like, and now I'm going to name a random state that happened to have an election. I'm going to try to put it on a map, make it visual for our listeners. We are going to get in a plane and fly down to Virginia and start in Virginia. Neither New Jersey nor New York. We're going to start in Virginia because, unlike most other states, Virginia and New Jersey, which is why I mentioned New Jersey, have off-year gubernatorial elections. So while most places have even years, they have odd years, and they happen to come right after presidential elections. So there's always there's way too much read into them because it's kind of the only tea leaves we have for a while, or some of the major tea leaves. So I'm going to pass it over to Rich because I know Rich, like me, has been looking at these exit polls, or the new version of exit polls that we talked about last week. There's tons of data on demographics, on turnout, and so forth. So, Rich, I'm going to ask you the catch-all. What stuck out to you about the Virginia and New Jersey gubernatorial races?
I think that what's interesting when you look at the exit polls is that a lot of the stuff that perhaps we had made too much of in 2024 has kind of evaporated in the data this time around. And I'm thinking specifically of younger people, 18 to 29 set of voters, and then also Latino voters. Those were two groups where there was really significant movement in the conservative direction in the 2024 election. And not to say necessarily that Trump won those outright, but did much better than expected. And there was a lot of hemming and hawing afterwards saying, well, is this the end of a coalition here? Is this a realignment happening? And it seems now that things have snapped back to what we maybe would have expected, right? Which is to say that young people very decisively voted for the Democrats in these elections here in Virginia and New Jersey. And the Latino vote really has sort of returned to maybe what you would expect. And I think one of the lessons here, I think, is that it's the economy, and these voters are just as sensitive to costs and what's happening in their own personal economies, and those things have not improved in the past year, and they are now taking it out on a new set of incumbents, or they're choosing to express their displeasure with Donald Trump by voting for Democrats in the elections that they have available to them.
Yeah, and grabbing one of those points, Rich, you mentioned, of course, that Latino voters have basically swung back. So just to cite a few numbers, I promise I'm not about to list a bunch, but if you compare the Harris margin in 2024 with the margin for Spanberger in Virginia, you had a 19-point margin for Harris and a 35-point margin among Latinos for Spanberger, which is much more in line with kind of what that margin would be expected to look like historically. You see a similar swing in New Jersey, where the margin went from 13 among Latinos up to 37. Interestingly, too, one group that was not available in past polls that I didn't see any margin for was Asian voters or AAPI voters, where you had, we don't know what it looked like historically for a lot of these races in specific states because the sample sizes just weren't there. But in Virginia, they found Spanberger with a 59-point win among Asian voters and Sherrill with a 67-point win. So that's one that's maybe not getting talked about as much yet, just because it's not one of the things we were talking about in 2024. But I would expect that those are going to be numbers that people are going to notice. And I wouldn't be surprised if we start to hear more discussion and more analysis of Asian voters going forward. Just if it is such a huge Democratic margin, you'll see Democrats perhaps start to pay a bit more attention.
And I think to kind of pull it back a little bit too, as I was talking with people today, kind of trying to gauge how they were responding to last night and kind of, does this seem like a promising thing going forward? Are there lessons from it? One thing that just kind of kept coming up was this phrasing of like the Democrats basically pitched a perfect game all across the country, this sense that it was extremely, extremely positive if you are a Democrat trying to say this was the first test of how people would respond to kind of Trump 2.0 here. So a lot of discussion has been around kind of pointing to the midterms, but just to give kind of a sampling of what we're talking about here, you not only have the New Jersey and Virginia governor's races, basically the entire Virginia state government swung blue here. That includes the lieutenant governor, the attorney general. Its state legislature went bluer than anyone actually expected it to go. In New York City, Mamdani not only became mayor, which had been, pretty likely given the polling, but he broke 50%. So it's the majority. He had more than 1 million votes, which is very unusual for recent New York mayor's races. In California, the efforts to redistrict through a referendum to kind of counter what's been done in the Texas mid-cycle redistricting, that also passed. Maine shot down voter ID laws. Pennsylvania kept its more liberal or Democratic Supreme Court. So when I was kind of looking through this, I was so struck by, maybe if you're a Republican in Texas, where there were a few kind of local ballot initiatives, maybe this looks better for you. But where there was a competitive race, I've sort of been struggling to see where Republicans were pulling it out this time around. And so I'm wondering if that squares with what you'd been seeing, hearing, wondering.
It certainly squares with what I've been reading, and there's a particularly good publication now called Bolts, which posts a lot on Blue Sky. They used to post on Twitter. I don't know if they do anymore, but definitely worth tracking them down and following them, because they do the most amazing job of elevating these races and telling us why they're important and why, the Bucks County School Board election is particularly interesting, for example, which I wouldn't even know was happening if they didn't cover it. And not only do they do that, but then on election night they actually do. They'll tell you what happened. They're not doing like a New York Times needle for everyone, but at least you can know, okay, this race that they highlighted for me and told me why it was interesting, here's what happened. So, just to list a couple that they mentioned, you mentioned in Pennsylvania, 2 open statewide judge seats. The Erie County Executive, they defended swing counties. They ousted GOPers, to use their word, from the Bucks County School Boards, which, as they put it, was once ground zero of a right-wing takeover. So I'm quoting here. These are not my words, but it's just the kind of thing that they do. And when you kind of take stock of all the things that they listed, it's pretty much a clean sweep for Dems. Like, somebody asked one of their writers, okay, well, what did Republicans win? And they were all holds. Basically, it was like, okay, an incumbent won. So that's good for the Republicans. But as far as like flips or major flips, when I last checked, it was pretty much all moving to the left.
Yeah. Well, one example I would just note in addition to those was down in the state of Georgia, they have a very somewhat obscure public service commission that essentially sets utility rates, electricity rates, right? Pretty, non-controversial stuff. Well, there were 2 seats open there and the Democrats swept both of them. So Democrats won 2 statewide seats in the state of Georgia, which is pretty remarkable, I think, and kind of shows that there's there's some spread here. We're not just talking about like super liberal New York City and, blue state New Jersey and purple to blue Virginia. We're talking and California. We're talking about kind of all over the place. We're seeing patterns, and you would think that would be if you're trying to read the tea leaves here, you would want to be looking at kind of some less than blue territories, and Georgia's an example of that.
Yeah, one thing that I kind of wanted to get your guys' read on is as soon as this happens, no one pulls their own hair out over victory more than Democrats do. So there was immediately like massive fracturing where folks were very excited, but then they were basically trying to be like, well, what is this? What does this mean? What's the plan? Like, is Mamdani more the Democratic brand, or is, Spanberger more the Democratic brand? And the question of, isn't this kind of old school, like you agree on sort of a generic set of values for the party, and then you tailor it to the areas that you're running. So it's not saying that you have kind of a million little planets out there, but you are kind of in basic agreement about what it means to be a quote unquote Democrat. And that can go all the way from democratic socialist to kind of like a more moderate liberal form. But when you were looking at these results, was there kind of a clear unifying message at this point, more complicated than the sitting president is so deeply, deeply unpopular in these areas? They didn't need to just run against Donald Trump. People are aware of the situation. So it does seem like any Republican was going to have to deal with the fact that the face of the Republican Party is pretty much underwater at this point, right?
Yeah, I think that it is definitely different flavors of Democrat, right? I mean, Mamdani and Spanberger are two pretty different politicians, but they were both talking about affordability and in a pretty consistent way, right? They were really hammering that economic message that is basically kind of how Trump got back in a year prior, and now they're kind of turning that against him because there hasn't been a lot of progress made, or at least felt, on the sorts of cost issues that we've been seeing in our polling in Massachusetts is like one of the top issues for a long time now that still hasn't really gone away. So it is tailored, I think, to every different location. What the brand will be coming out of it, I think, is probably going to be, defined as much by punditry outside of the party. But I think the main message is like, I heard a lot of consistency in terms of the economic message, and then it was tailored kind of more to the style of how it was presented, and who was the presenter was the thing that differed depending on where you were.
And I would, first of all, agree with what Rich said, and add to that the economic message also varied in a couple interesting ways, because, Virginia, of course, is right next to D.C., and the government is currently shut down. And well before the shutdown, contractors, government workers were just getting hammered, like just wrecked by first Doge and then all of the, reductions in force. And now the government shut down, and questions about whether or not they'll even get paid if they're currently furloughed and end up coming back. So the exit poll that they did shed a little bit of light on this, where they asked voters in Virginia and found that 22% of them either are a federal worker themselves or were a contractor within the last year. And then, of course, those folks suffered serious economic damage. And even more broadly than that, of course, it's not just those workers, but it's everybody who relies on them, and all of the service companies that, do all the things that are required to keep a big company or contractor or government agency or government building kind of functional. So when they asked the question, how much did federal cuts this year affect your finances, they had 59% saying that there had been an impact. So most voters in Virginia felt the impact of the federal cuts. So that's to say that the economy, when somebody might mention it in New York, is probably different than somebody who would say it in New Jersey or Georgia or somewhere else. But yes, I would say that Trump and the economy probably are the two main things, if you had to pick two that were mentioned by the most Democratic candidates and Democratic-leaning candidates.
And we're going to get, I think, a pretty good look at how the Democrats decide to fine-tune that messaging and how voters feel about any given pitch from some of their representatives in a local Senate race. So we're going to get into that right after the break.
I'm Zainab Asma-Doyle, Research Director at the MassINC Polling Group. The MassINC Polling Group serves the region's leading foundations, political groups, government entities, and businesses. Our surveys and focus groups bring high-quality data to the toughest questions facing society today. Learn more at massincpolling.com.
So looking a bit into the future, although perhaps in a speculative way, we should probably touch on how there is a new report from Politico that U.S. Rep. Ayanna Pressley, who represents parts of Boston and the surrounding area, may be looking at entering the Senator Ed Markey race. And of course, U.S. Rep. Seth Moulton is already in that. We've talked about him a little bit in the past. So let's talk about some new polling that we have on kind of Markey's prospects, how he's stacking up against any potential challengers or existing challengers. But first, I'd love to get your read, Steve and Rich. Based on what you've seen so far in the polling, is Ayanna Pressley potentially entering the race a complicating factor for Markey, or was this always going to be sort of messy?
You know, I think that this new poll, which was done by UMass Amherst for WCVB in Boston, kind of finds that Markey is doing okay here. Head to head with Moulton, he's 51% to 28%. And then when you introduce Pressley as a third option here, Markey leads with 35% of the vote. So it does go down a little bit compared to 25 for Moulton and 21 for Pressley. I should say there is a fourth candidate that was polled here, Alex Rickley, who got in prior to Seth Moulton. But he is polling a pretty small percentage of the vote here. I think the interesting thing about this is, Seth Moulton got in, I think, at a time when a lot of Democrats are pretty down on the party, according to opinion polling, and a lot of concern about the age of people in kind of the higher echelons of the Democratic establishment. Despite that, we're still seeing Markey basically getting to a majority directly against Moulton in this poll. And I have to wonder, now that the Democrats have tasted victory for the first time in a while, whether or not those concerns, that lack of favorability among their own voters is still going to be there, or whether it's going to start to improve, and maybe the case for running against Markey starts to evaporate a little bit, both for Moulton and for Pressley if she chooses to get in.
There was a question where they asked voters to rank the top three qualities that are most important when deciding who to vote for in the Senate primary, and put in one item which was represents a new generation of leadership, and a grand total of 0% of the voters who responded to the poll actually chose that one. And this was one where you could, choose from a defined list. It wasn't like you had to kind of come up with it. So that was on the one hand. However, when you asked what's one word that describes Ed Markey, and you could say whatever you wanted, they have a word cloud here, which, as always, you love to hear us describe visual items on a podcast. The biggest word right in the middle is old. The other ones are good, experienced, progressive, liberal, lots of other things that I think are why Ed Markey kind of retains. It's 51% in this survey when you include leaners, why he retains pretty strong numbers, but, he certainly is going to have that challenge. And we should also note that, but for folks like us, most people have no idea what's going on in this race yet. So what issues are going to be elevated, et cetera, we just have no idea at this point.
Yeah, I am really curious about, let's say that this becomes a 3-person primary. So again, Ayanna Pressley has not specifically said that she is running, but they are exploring it. That is what is being reported out from Politico right now. I'm curious, in the wake of the elections that we just saw, one, to Rich's point, how do people kind of feel about the Democrats as a brand right now? But in a place like Massachusetts, where it's considered relatively safe to be kind of a wide array of what Democrat means, how each of these candidates would try and tailor their message to where they think, at least to their electorate or the broader electorate nationally, is going. So half the time for me, when there's sort of intra-party disputes or primaries, the way that people talk about what they can bring is often the most telling thing. And so I also was struck by if you're using kind of coded language like a new generation of leadership, that is not what people tend to latch on to. But if you get kind of more pointed about it and say, well, if you're not worried about sort of the lefty bona fides, if there was someone like Presley coming up afterward, would people then say, well, if I have a choice between X or Y, more similar on the ideology and policy front, but one is an older politician and one is kind of an ascendant younger politician, how they decide to make those choices is really interesting to me, because Massachusetts, like New York in some ways, allows for more of a spread in the Democrats that it sends into office.
Yeah, and I should say too that age, in other surveys, when it was asked more directly, it was more of a factor. Jen, you point out that in the wording of this question, it may not have been sharp enough for people to latch onto and say, no, I want to say that Ed Markey is too old. I don't want to do this represents a new generation thing. So that point I would certainly agree with. There's also some very interesting things, speaking of Presley, specifically within the crosstabs, particularly on ideology. So when you're looking at liberal voters and it's just Ed Markey versus Seth Moulton, Ed Markey takes 57% of liberal voters. Then you add in Ayanna Presley and his number drops to 36%. So Ayanna Presley actually takes 30% of those liberal voters, and that's her main block. She doesn't do nearly as well with moderate or conservative voters, and that certainly will be a challenge, when this thing starts. The other thing worth noting, of course, is the old question of vote splitting. So if you've got Ed Markey, quite liberal, or seen as quite liberal, I should say, just based on kind of how the numbers are. You've got Ayanna Presley, seen as liberal. Do they split the vote and leave basically the lane for the moderate to eke out a victory? And that in many variations happens so often when in these primaries where the winning tally might be 35, 36, 37%.
I think it's interesting. Jen and I, when Jen and I were talking about when Moulton got in, we noted in his ad that he really was not presenting himself as a moderate. He was really kind of leaning in more into the liberal direction. He was not trying to make this sort of a primary from the center of someone to the left. He was really making it more about the age issue and the experience and the fight issue. Who's going to be able to bring the fight to Donald Trump? Now that if there were to be another liberal candidate, it would be very interesting to see if he starts to try to tack back and sort of take that more moderate ground, which I think of as sort of his natural political base, a little bit more so than these other two candidates, and try to shoot the gap as the centrist candidate, if you will, and have Markey and Presley kind of split that more liberal vote. It's sort of interesting to think if these candidates had gotten into the race in a different order, how their strategies may have differed and how they choose to present themselves.
And as we are recording this, again, Wednesday, fast-moving news, we now have some insight into the Republican primary side of things. Steve, what have we got? This is new information to me. I trust you. Don't lie to me.
I'm just going to make up a poll, whole cloth. No, seriously, UMass, who produced the poll we were just talking about on the Democratic side, the Democratic Senate side, has now dropped the Republican primary side and also a general election look at the gubernatorial election. So we have on the Republican side, they did a horse race and found that before you ask the leaner question, you've got 43% saying unsure, that is the leader. Following not sure, we've got Mike Keneally with 27%, and then Brian Shortsleeve and Mike Minogue, both at 15%. Then when you ask that 43%, okay, but who are you leaning towards? Actually, Mike Keneally takes a pretty significant lead with 44% of voters saying that they would vote for him, and you still have the other two down in the mid-teens. So big lead for Mike Keneally, but a lot of uncertainty, both in that question. There were a couple other questions that they asked that kind of highlight that when you ask just how familiar when you ask just how familiar are you with these three candidates, you see 52% saying either not too or not at all familiar. And then when you ask, to place them on an ideological spectrum anywhere, all three of them, the most common answer is, I don't know. So this, in a way, is a pretty common dynamic for recent Massachusetts primaries where, when you've got one candidate who starts off as the favorite, the other party's primary candidates really struggle mightily to get their names, to become well known and to kind of get their names out.
Yeah, and this does connect as well to something that I've also been chatting with some people about after the Wednesday election, which is to what extent, because we've made reference before to the idea of a generic Democrat, the advantage that someone does or doesn't have by just sort of being loosely associated with one party or another. And in Massachusetts, especially during any given Trump era, any Republican candidate, no matter how closely tied they are or aren't to the president specifically, does kind of have to carry that. So I'm curious to what extent, as we head toward the gubernatorial election, whether voters who are familiar with Healy might just kind of place a Democrat over her and place a Republican over whoever ends up coming out of the primary. So sometimes, and especially as all politics are national, sometimes it's just the letter next to your name that helps the voter in any given state decide what to do with it.
I think that's absolutely right. I think you'll see Maura Healey try to nationalize the race as well, which should not be hard given the challenges that the federal government is presenting to Massachusetts on multiple fronts in terms of funding and program cuts and ICE enforcement and all these sorts of things. I wanted to call attention to another question in the survey, if I might. They asked people what their top three qualities were most important to them in choosing a candidate, and the top three, and so things were, people were allowed to choose three off of a list that was pre-generated. The top things were, honest and trustworthy, best represents my views on the issues. 14% said supports President Trump's agenda. Pick that as their top priority. Another 7% picked that as second and 8% third. A smaller number, 5%, said has the endorsement of President Trump. And then only 2% said has the endorsement of former Governor Charlie Baker. And I think that really tells you something really interesting about how the Republican primary electorate, the Republican base in the state, has shifted since the time that Charlie Baker was first elected governor, which was not that long ago, really, honestly. So, it is there. It's, I wouldn't say it's overwhelming that the Trump thing is not one of the top things that people cited, but it is higher than the Baker thing. So I think that's going to be this really interesting dynamic. Someone's going to have to get through this primary dealing with the voters that want the Trump part, and then is going to have to deal with the whole other pool of voters that probably want nothing to do with the Trump part. And that's really kind of shooting that gap has been the thing that's been a real challenge for statewide Republican candidates in the past few years.
And that path is especially complicated because when you look at approval ratings, President Trump has a 27% approval rating in Massachusetts. So if you get that endorsement, if you win in that lane in the Republican primary, then you have, at the top of the ticket that you're running on, then you have at the top of the party that you're running on a leader with a 27% approval rating and whose policies by every measure in Massachusetts are very unpopular. So looking then at how those general election matchups actually look, they asked Governor Maura Healey against each of the three Republican candidates and found her with quite a large lead in each case. So Governor Healey has between 48% and 51%, and you've got the Republican candidates with either 26 or 27%. So right now, a pretty significant lead, obviously a long way to go. Not making any predictions, but that is where things stand with this fresh breaking news poll that by the time you listen to this will be yesterday's poll, but still is quite interesting and you should go read it.
Well, I mean, we will have plenty of time for postmortems, premortems, whatever, relationship with races and or death you want to have in the future, but that is all the time we have for today. I'm Jennifer Smith signing off with Steve Cazella and Rich Parr. Our production and theme music is done by Charlie Cazella. You can write to us at thehorse-race-podcast@gmail.com. Don't forget to give The Horse Race a review wherever you're hearing us now. Subscribe to Commonwealth Beacon's Daily Download and reach out to the MassINC Polling Group if you need polls or focus groups done. Thank you all for listening. See you next week.